Air power has made decisive contributions to many military campaigns. And in the 20th and 21st century, many major military powers have invested significantly in trying to make sure they dominate the skies in the event of any conflict. A problem with just how effective aircraft can be, however, is that the other side tends to know it. And thus the incentive is often there for an opponent to basically say, hey, nice air power you've got there. It sure would be a shame if something happened to it. And given that combat aircraft in the air do tend to be comparatively difficult targets, historically, whether you're talking about December 1941 or June 2025, that something has often occurred when the aircraft are on the ground. In that respect, you might look at Ukraine's recent Operation Spiderweb as both a warning and a wake-up call. A warning that new weapons and new tactics at both the high and low end of the capability and cost spectrum may have significantly outpaced the ability of air forces to defend themselves on the ground. After all, the Ukrainians aren't the only force out there with access to drone technology, and the Russians aren't the only ones who park aircraft in the open, with all the potential implications that raises, both for deterrence and the possible course of any future conflict. And so today, in a follow-on from our discussion of Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb, we're going to ask how global air forces might work to prevent something similar, or worse, happening to them, covering both the evolution of potential threats and the defences that might be available to counter them, from the active, innovative and high-tech, through to very old and proven defensive technologies like dirt, steel and concrete. And so today we'll be discussing force protection, specifically air force protection in a post-Spiderweb world. And while we'll be focusing on aircraft and supporting infrastructure, a lot of the basic concepts here could apply to other assets as well. We'll start with how the threat has evolved and then move on to potential responses. That includes dispersion and concepts like agile combat employment, active defence and also passive defence. That last one will lead into the debate around hardened aircraft shelters, the idea that you can protect air bases and aircraft by building boxes around them. And just a warning up front as a bit of a TLDR, I won't be equivocating in that case. I'll be making an argument as to why I think from a defence economics perspective, you should just go ahead and build the bloody boxes. Note the flow of this episode and the way it sounds might be a little bit different to normal. Some of the slides are drawn from presentation materials I came up with some time ago, rather than having been developed specifically for YouTube, and so the way they flow might also be a tad different. In any case, before we jump into it, let me welcome back a sponsor. Do you remember a time where it didn't feel like world-changing events happened almost every second week? I do too, but in 2025, that's not the world we live in. And with staying across all of those stories and all of the different angles on them being the task that it is, you might want a tool to help. For example, as we click through these headlines on Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb, the drone attack against Russia's strategic bomber fleet, you'll see the difference between what information different news organisations choose or don't choose to elevate to their headline. There's a major difference between this one, for example, which surfaces the Russian claim that the relevant bombers were only damaged, not destroyed, while this one flags the fact that we do have satellite imagery confirming destroyed bombers. The tool being used here is long-term channel sponsor Ground News. By reportedly drawing on approximately 50,000 news sources around the world, what it can allow you to do is scan headlines, see how a given story is being covered, as well as surfacing potentially useful context, like ownership information, or factuality ratings based on the work of 3 independent news monitoring organisations. It also comes with additional features. If you're concerned about echo chambers, for example, what the blind spot feed can potentially allow you to do is see the kind of stories that are overwhelmingly being covered by the kind of news sources you might not ordinarily consume. You still may not think they're good sources, but if you're like me, you might genuinely want to know what kind of angle and stories that other sources around the internet are picking up. And so if you're interested in trying it out, there will be a link in the description. That'll give you access to a 40% discount on their Vantage plan, which is the one I've been using for some time now. And so, with my genuine thanks to Ground News, let's get back to it. Okay, so let's start with the basic problem, protecting the force, or in this case, specifically the Air Force. Because you see, fixed-wing aircraft generally have a bit of a problem. As fast, as manoeuvrable, as survivable as they happen to be in the air, they're not particularly agile or survivable on the ground. And so that's often where an opponent has chosen to try and hunt them. And especially when an opponent could achieve operational surprise, we have historical precedent for Air Forces being punished pretty heavily on the ground. We saw this with Operation Barbarossa in 1941, with the invading Germans inflicting enormous damage on the Soviet VVS, both in the air and on the ground. We also saw the Japanese inflict triple-digit airframe losses on the United States with their surprise attacks on Pearl Harbor and the Philippines in December 1941. Then, if you want a Cold War example, you might want to look at the Israeli Operation Focus at the beginning of the Six-Day War. That inflicted devastating damage on the Arab air forces for relatively few Israeli losses, which illustrated pretty starkly that while there might be a qualitative gap between a Mirage and a MiG in the air, that gap is even wider when the MiG is on the ground at the time the Mirage arrives. In a sense, then, you can argue that what the Ukrainians just executed was different in terms of the how, specifically the way they leveraged small drones shipped close to their targets, but not necessarily different in terms of the concepts it was leveraging. The fact that aircraft have to be fragile, that they're valuable, they're difficult to replace, and that they can be vulnerable at their air bases. So counter-air operations are always going to have potential military value and might be an attractive option for nations worried about opposing air power. It seems kind of strange to pivot to theoretical results after we've just talked about practical historical examples, but theoretical exercises often bear this out as well. In some of the war games done by the CSIS, covering a Taiwan Strait escalation scenario, in their version of events, in their model, the vast majority of US Air Force losses occurred on the ground, not in the air. A context where so many of those investments the United States has made in the survivability of its aircraft, from electronic warfare to ejection seats for pilot survivability to stealthy features for their airframes, mattered somewhere between jack and shit. Because while in the air a B-2 Spirit or an F-22 Raptor might be a ghost, on the ground it's a big lumbering metal object visible to every satellite passing overhead. So okay, we've established that aircraft on their air bases are often vulnerable in the same way military forces have often been while they're encamped. Forces historically have tried to deal with that basic vulnerability of the encamped force in a variety of ways. You could argue the old Roman legions, for example, combined both active and passive defences. Active defences in the form of lookouts, trained war dogs, etc. to detect a potential approaching enemy force, and passive defences in the form of things like entrenchments, palisades, barriers that protected the legion while it was in camp. A lot of extra work for the soldiers, and a slowing factor when the force was on the march, but a significant protection for that force whenever it wasn't in motion. We'll talk a little bit about how some of those basic defensive concepts, both active and passive, have evolved in the modern context a little bit later on. But to start with, I think before we discuss how to protect against a potential threat, we need to understand the threat, which brings us to this section, threat evolution. There are some broad trends you could arguably identify in terms of the weapon systems available to potential adversaries, basically no matter what force you're trying to analyse from the perspective of. An increase in range, for example. Complexity and lethality, so weapons getting more accurate, more dangerous. But another big change is also accessibility and availability. Availability just means everyone might have access to many more of those systems than they did previously. The Chinese rocket force, for example, is much larger than it used to be. And the other aspect is accessibility. Who can potentially get access to specific capabilities? What something like a drone or a loitering munition allows, for example, is perhaps an irregular or poorly funded regular force who get access to a kind of precision-guided weapon at a striking distance that it might not otherwise have been able to achieve, especially not in a package that small, that simple, that accessible. In terms of specific challenges to the defender, though, I want to focus on the defeat mechanism. This is the broad way in which an attacker hopes to get their weapon through an opposing defense system. And because the defender often has the unenviable task of trying to prevent the attacker getting through the air defense system to the squishy targets underneath, no matter what method they use, let's actually start by putting our attacker hat on and talking through some of those methods and the technologies that are improved behind them. For example, you might have high-end penetrating threats, where you have a weapon system that is designed to punch through an air defense system because it can't be successfully intercepted, or at least not reliably intercepted. This is a domain of things like hypersonic glide vehicles, think the Chinese DF-17. This is also where you might put high-end ballistic missile threats or stealthy cruise missiles. Another approach might be to go to the other end of the spectrum. Instead of trying to design something that can punch through an air defense system, design something that can either exhaust it or saturate it. So subtly different. An exhaustion-based system is one where you look at an air defense system that might be able to intercept 100 incoming threats because they have 100 interceptors in inventory, and so you respond by firing more than that. Then you have an approach that, for simplicity here, I'm going to call saturation, which is not so much about exhausting the opposing defense system full stop. It's based on firing more threats against that system that it can intercept in a given period of time. A third version of this quantity approach to saturation would be the real-world military equivalent of just fishing for that natural 20 in a game of D&D. Instead of designing a weapon system that can punch through a significant portion of the time, like 50% or 60%, or that's capable of actually exhausting or overwhelming enemy air defenses, you just play the numbers. You embrace the fact that no air defense system is ever going to be 100% effective. There's always a risk of human error, technical failure, etc. And so you just find something with a low probability of success and you repeat it time and time and time and time and time again on the understanding that eventually something is going to win that 1% chance game and get through. And if the attacking system is cheap enough and available enough compared to the target being attacked, that might still be a militarily useful exchange. The big innovation here has arguably been the one-way attack drone, specifically the cheap one-way attack drone. The Iranian Shahed is probably the most famous example, although by this point Ukraine has plenty of its own homegrown systems as well. And depending on their performance characteristics, as they become more widely available, more affordable subsonic cruise missiles might fit into this category as well. If you want an easy analogy for these different methods, imagine you're trying to get a ball past a goalie. The high-end option is to bring in a top-tier player who can slot it into the corner at twice the speed of sound before the goalie can possibly get there. Saturation is getting 3 players to kick 3 balls at the same time, and exhaustion is getting a bunch of mediocre players to take turns kicking 1 ball at the goalie every 10 seconds, until eventually, a couple of hours later, human frailties force him to admit defeat. Then there's a final mechanism to talk about: attacks and threats that are designed to get through an air defense system, not by being so complex that they can evade it, but by being so simple that the system is not appropriately configured to deal with them. A traditional example of this might be just bringing artillery in range of an opposing airfield. The Vietnamese did this against the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where they responded to the French doing aerial resupply of their forces and their fortresses there by dragging pretty much by hand an artillery force into the mountains surrounding the base and then just shelling it. This is also the domain of things like mortar attacks on coalition bases in Afghanistan, where you have a relatively non-complex threat that you're not going to shoot down with a Patriot missile, for example, that's relatively accessible to local forces and can be used against the squishy aircraft targets. But countermeasures have been developed to that. The mortar threat to bases, for example, is one that you can respond to with a variety of techniques. Counter-battery radar are a thing, so you can detect where the rounds are coming from and respond in kind. Counter-rocket artillery and mortar systems, CRAM, is a thing, which is capable of shooting down incoming mortar and artillery rounds and low-tech rockets. And also you can do responsive air patrol. So maybe this is the domain of drones, attack helicopters, etc., that can hunt down these teams that are launching these attacks and neutralize them. Another traditional form here would be sabotage. We've seen this with the war in Ukraine, Ukrainian saboteurs making their way onto Russian airstrips and then destroying Russian aircraft by setting them on fire. In this case, in the case of this Sukhoi 30 that you can see on the right there, literally building an open fire under the aircraft, setting it alight and then running because the aircraft do not respond well to fire. Another approach would be direct action. Think things like car bombs or direct assaults, where you suddenly attack a base, either from within or without, inside a threat or outside a threat. But across a lot of these threats, the countermeasures might be difficult, but are broadly understood. You need security forces, you need counter-battery radars, you need situational awareness, and you need the ability to rapidly respond to these kind of threats. You're protecting a perimeter, if you will. My argument would essentially be that small UAS and loitering munitions combine different aspects of those existing threats into a more concerning package. What do I mean by that? You might now have drones, for example, with the reach of traditional artillery systems. The Russians and Ukrainians have both used fibre optic drones, for example, which are resistant to soft-kill countermeasures like jamming, with ranges measured in the dozens of kilometres. Numbers as high as 40 and 50 have been cited. That's a lot of cable, but that's also a lot of reach. But at the same time, while they have the reach of artillery, they're much more accessible than artillery. You can't exactly go into Alibaba and order yourself an M109 self-propelled gun, the ammunition for it, and the know-how to use it. You can order yourself a drone, some fibre optic cable, and then work things out from there. So the number of forces that will be able to access this technology is far greater. The concealability of that technology is much greater. There's also a safety factor. If you're launching a mortar attack against a coalition airbase, or you're launching a direct assault against a defended air facility, you're probably not walking away if history is to be any measure. The Ukrainian saboteurs on those bases, for example, are taking an enormous risk, and we've seen the Ukrainians lose multiple sabotage and reconnaissance teams. Drone strikes are different. The operators, as we saw with Operation Spiderweb, can be positioned nowhere near the drones that they're launching through the magic of some of the modern communication techniques used, and as a result, the chance of casualties is probably lower as long as your network is intact. What that means is the risk involved is lower, and the chance of you getting people who are willing to participate is also higher. The lethality point then basically comes down to these being precision munitions. These are guided weapons. Unlike traditional mortar rounds or artillery shells, they can be guided by an operator or potentially onboard guidance to more reliably hit the target. That doesn't mean they're perfect. We saw this with Operation Spiderweb, for example. The Ukrainians claim, I think, more than 110 drones launched, and we have evidence of perhaps 12 aircraft visually confirmed destroyed and maybe somewhere between 20 and 40 hits. But that's still a very high success rate for a relatively concealable, accessible weapon system being used against a very well-defended and very valuable target. And it leads into this final point around penetration. Not only are these things accurate, potentially dangerous, accessible, long-ranged, and provide more safety for their operators, they're also relatively good at getting around a lot of existing air defense systems. They can fly relatively close to the ground. They can use buildings for cover. Because they have the benefit of a human operator in at least some cases, they're not going to fly a predictable pattern, probably the same way an incoming mortar round or rocket might. A drone is not going to obligingly do that, and if an operator is smart, maps out the defences in advance, they might provide even more of a challenge. This is especially the case if things like drones or satellites enable the reconnaissance of those defences in advance, and for an attack plan to factor them in. The basic gist here is the sword is sharper. Attackers now have more options to get at air bases and other soft targets, whether that's by punching through, getting around, getting under, or exhausting an air defence system. And that provides a challenge, especially when you take account of the threat context. That being said, let's talk about some of the ways air forces have already hinted they might try and make themselves more survivable in the context of all these threats, both at the high end and to an extent at the low end too. A big movement has been towards survivability through dispersal. That is, you shuffle your aircraft around so they're not in the base when your opponent is aiming for when they're hit. This has been absolutely critical to the Ukrainian experience. Despite the Russians having access to cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, hypersonics, satellites, etc., somehow the Ukrainians are still flying. As US Air Force General James Hecker reportedly put it, quote, "I have the opportunity to talk to the Ukrainian air chief once every 2 weeks or so, and they've been very successful in not getting their aircraft hit on the ground. And I asked him, I said, how is that? What do you do? And he goes, well, we never take off and land at the same airfield. I'm like, okay, that's pretty good. Keeps the Russians on their toes," end quote. The Russians similarly, while initially they didn't have to do this much, have turned more and more to this dispersal and responsiveness as the war has gone on. They've done this in two respects, both by moving a lot of aircraft back further away from the Ukrainian border to put them out of range of certain weapons and also to increase warning times, and also by using the ability of aircraft to scatter as a defence mechanism. This is mostly useful because the Ukrainians use a lot of very slow-moving subsonic one-way attack drones as their long-range option. They don't have hypersonic missiles, they don't have ballistic missiles in significant numbers, and the ones they do have don't generally have the range to be used against the Russian air bases that are currently in use. ATACMS, for example, even if they had permission to fire them into Russia from the moment they got them, won't reach, for example, Russia's strategic bomber bases. So what Russian practice has often become is that when the Russians detect an incoming drone strike, the aircraft at the base that may be being targeted will take off, displace, and those drones will hit, hopefully, an empty airstrip. Even before we saw that Ukrainian and Russian experience develop, though, the US Air Force was already working with a concept based around dispersion and maneuverability. This was and is Agile Combat Employment, or ACE. I have a quote there from Air Force Doctrine Note 1-21, Agile Combat Employment, back in August 2022, from the Director of Government Programs and Wargaming at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Quote, "The best place to kill an enemy's air force is on the ground, especially if that air force is postured in bases that are few in number and lack passive defences, such as shelters and decoys, and active defences, such as kinetic and non-kinetic interceptors, EW, and directed energy weapons that can help counter those air and missile threats." In a technical sense, ACE consists of 5 core elements: posture, command and control, movement and manoeuvre, protection, and sustainment. But the bit we're really concerned with to start with is the idea of posture. The goal here was to make a force that could rapidly execute operations from various different locations, so one that wouldn't be reliant just on a couple of permanent bases, but could instead shuffle around aircraft and resources to multiple different airstrips, air bases, including austere locations, and carry out operations from there. I have some quotes highlighted on the right there from Doctrinal Note 1-21 back in 2022 on Agile Combat Employment. Quote, "Operational unpredictability is enabled through the agility of forces across pre-postured locations, increasing the number of locations an adversary must target. The increased number of dispersed locations presents adversaries with challenges from the tactical to the strategic level. That is, if the opponent has to destroy more bases, they need more weapons in order to do it." It goes on. "Risk to force may prohibit massing personnel at locations inside enemy weapon engagement zones, e.g. unconventional ground forces, small unmanned aircraft systems, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and hypersonic weapons. Risk management is critical to balance survivability with combat operations tempo by stationing forces at various proximity to the fight and associated threats." In other words, if you're operating inside your opponent's threat envelope, then you need to be really cautious about where you put your aircraft. You want them as close as possible and in the best infrastructure possible to maintain their sortie rate, but at the same time, the closer you are, and the more missions you can fly, the more vulnerable you might be to incoming threats. And so balancing them is at the core of the ACE framework. But of course, if you just spread out to multiple locations, there's nothing to stop your opponent just figuring out where your aircraft are among those locations and only targeting those ones. So the second component of ACE is movement and manoeuvre. You need to be able to move your assets between those different airstrips. Quote, "ACE provides greater agility and ability to outpace an adversary's action through movement and manoeuvre to achieve and fight from positions of advantage. Agility is capable of disrupting an adversary's decision cycle by creating multiple dilemmas with which they must contend." End quote. This is basically the Ukrainian Air Force's way of war, written at large in a US doctrinal document. You're continuously shuffling your aircraft between bases so that your opponent doesn't have time to confirm where they are and route a weapon in time to hit them before they are somewhere else. Protection then layers on top of that, and command and control enables that. The challenge, of course, is that means that you're only going to have so many permanent bases to operate from, so if you want a massive number of bases that you can fly from, preferably that are close to the theatre, you might end up flying for some pretty austere locations. On the right there, you can see an example of an exercise the US Marines did, flying F-35Bs from basically an airstrip in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. You fly in the kit, you fly in the aircraft, and you work with what you've got at a local level. That's possible for a degree of combat operation, but it obviously comes with drawbacks. I have a 2019 quote on the right there from General Brown, who at the time was the Chief of Staff of the US Air Force, saying that really you only need a certain amount of very basic things in order to generate combat power. Quote, "To generate combat power from a number of locations to create dilemmas for an adversary, I just need a runway, a ramp, a weapons trailer, a fuel bladder, and a pallet of MREs. That's maybe a little bit bold, but the point is we've got to be light, lean, and agile." The challenge, of course, is there is always going to be a limit to what you can actually generate from those bases. If you don't have full maintenance facilities, if you don't have all your spare parts, if you don't have everything you need that you would have at a permanent base, you're not going to be able to turn around aircraft as much, you're not going to be able to make the same repairs. There's also the obvious drawback that the more locations you have and the more austere they are, the more limited your ability to effectively defend each of them is going to be. At a permanent base, like Diego Garcia, for example, you might be able to install a THAAD battery for ballistic threats, a Patriot battery, some short-range air defenses, build bunkers and permanent revetments, etc. But you're not going to be able to have all that if you're talking about a sandbar in the middle of the Pacific that you happen to put an airstrip on. And that potentially matters because, while yes, Ukraine and Russia have both proven that you can amp up aircraft survivability by shuffling them around and remaining agile, there are obviously limits. Firstly, functionality. You're only going to be able to operate a force out of austere conditions for so long, especially when you're talking about the likes of the F-35. It's not exactly a Toyota Hilux. And so while yes, you can fly it out of a sandbar in the middle of the Pacific for a while, eventually it's going to want to go home. These platforms are glampers, not campers. And between those limitations and the risk of operating somewhere without a layered air defense system, we've seen US Air Force figures acknowledge the limitations of the concept. General Hecker, for example, reportedly put it as follows, quote, "So to go think you're going to land at another airfield and hang out there for a week with no defence, you're going to get schwacked. It's going to happen. You can only stay out there for a little bit, and then you've got to get back to your main operating bases. It's going to be much shorter operations, We're not talking weeks anymore. We're talking days, and sometimes we're talking hours if you want to be survivable, and then back to your main operating base where you've got the layered defence." End quote. And then beyond that, you might also have issues of accessibility and availability. You might only have so many bases close to the theatre you want to operate in, and you might not necessarily be able to assume all of them will be accessible during wartime. If they're based in friendly nations, for example, and relations deteriorate to a point where during a war they decide, maybe we don't want to provide you access, US Air Force, and instead we're going to stay out of this whole thing and not get bombed in the process, suddenly you might be shit out of luck. And the third problem, you can't be shuffling your aircraft forever. Displacing airframes, their maintenance crews, their supplies continuously between various bases costs you flying hours, it costs you dollars, it costs you readiness. And so it's something that the Air Force assumes it's only going to have to do under wartime conditions. The challenge I pose, however, is you can't assume at this point that you will only be attacked under wartime conditions. Because in a world of grey zone operations and accessible drones, it may not be that simple. Remember, the three historical examples I gave at the start of major damage being done to Air Force on the ground were all surprise attacks at the start of a conflict. Operation Barbarossa, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and Operation Focus in 1967. Obviously, that kind of risk of a surprise attack has never truly gone away. And while it's not the topic of today's video, some of the early reporting we have about Israeli operations against Iran over the last week seem to suggest the Israelis, like the Ukrainians before them, may have tapped some of these threat options. Sneaking drones or other small precision munitions into Iranian territory for use against critical but vulnerable targets like air defense systems. Even though the world now understands how an operation like the Ukrainian one could potentially be conducted, I'd argue that doesn't mean the risk has gone away. And in some ways, I'd argue the risk may have actually gotten considerably worse. And what I mean here is there's an argument to suggest that the deterrent structures that you might rely on to prevent these kind of attacks may not really apply now in the way they might once have done. This is the rise of grey zone and hybrid operations, where basically it's become increasingly normalised around the world that there are certain hostile, even kinetic actions you can take directly or indirectly against your competitors without necessarily sparking a full-scale war. In other words, if you're careful and lucky, you might be able to start some shit without getting hit. It's not exactly secret, for example, that many NATO states suspect that Russia is responsible for cutting a number of undersea cables. But while many states have been quick to accuse, they haven't been quick to treat it as the start of an outright war. We've also seen alleged acts of sabotage, for example, the destruction of a Czech ammunition storage facility back in 2014. It's generally assessed by a number of European nations now that that was a Russian operation. And yet, despite it resulting in the destruction of militarily valuable resources, it didn't result in an escalation to a conventional kinetic conflict. But even more than that, we've seen cases of direct military action by one nation against the military forces of another nation, somehow without that being an act of war, or at least interpreted as such. For example, after the assassination of Iranian General Soleimani during the first Trump administration, Iran responded by firing missiles at US military bases in Iraq, injuring American servicemen. And yet, before long, things seem to be at least mostly back to normal. So how does that really shape the risk I'm talking about here? You have a chance or a possibility that an opponent might calculate that they can launch an attack against a valuable military asset without running the full risk of full military escalation. And because drones are a relatively non-complex threat type compared to something like a hypersonic or ballistic missile, it's not inconceivable that a state actor might give a non-state actor, a proxy, or some other deniable asset access to these kind of systems and use them to launch strikes outside of the context of a full-scale war or potentially at the start of one. And the deniability of using a proxy or a non-state actor to deliver that attack is made all the more credible by the fact that these attacks are so simple that we've seen non-state actors be able to carry them out. Back in 2018, for example, Russian aircraft in Syria came under attack from very simple one-way attack drones being used by Syrian rebels. Based on what the Russians themselves showed off, these were absolutely the kind of drones that someone could have put together in a backyard shed, provided that backyard shed was in Syria, where there are a lot of spare explosives lying around to arm them. So you naturally raise the spectre of a scenario where if a power was looking for a way to strike against its opponent without causing a full-scale escalation, it might conclude it could potentially pull off something like this while blaming a middleman. And if they start doing the calculus around how much damage an operation of that kind might be able to inflict versus how much it would cost and what risks would be involved, from a deterrence perspective, just how valuable some of these targets are becomes an issue. Now, to be fair, I'm not exactly sure how Russian saboteurs could expect to get onto the island of Diego Garcia, which is where the shot on the right comes from, but I think you get the point. That's 4 B-2 Spirits in the open at roughly $2 billion per aircraft. It might take $2,000 in drones and a little bit of planning to inflict $8 billion worth of irreplaceable aircraft losses. With the B-21 radar production not really ramped up, America's inventory of stealth bombers very, very small and limited, even that loss of just the aircraft you can see on screen there could significantly shape US or allied operations in any conflict that followed. So I'd argue that means air forces can't rely just on mobility for their defence. Eventually, you're going to have to defend the air bases your aircraft are based at, especially during peacetime. That then logically pushes you into the territory of active and passive defences, actually protecting the air bases and the aircraft you have. We'll start with active defences, talk about how they're used and some of the primary challenges. Where is the primary challenge from an active defence perspective? Because I'd tentatively suggest that the future airborne threat that most countries are concerned about is probably not Tom Cruise in a manned jet doing a Death Star-style trench run through a canyon system in order to deliver laser-guided bombs against a precision target. I'm sure that's probably a threat, but not one that dominates the planning in this area. Instead, forces might be flagging a couple of potential gaps from a threat defence perspective. We've already flagged some of these, so let's quickly go through them and some of the potential responses nations might turn to. So gap 1. Penetrating high-end systems that we discussed earlier. This is the realm of your hypersonics, your ballistics, etc. The potential solution here we already understand. If you're facing a better missile, the answer is to get better sensors to detect them and better interceptors that are capable of hitting them. This might be things like the hypersonic glide phase interceptor to take out hypersonic glide vehicles. From a defense economics perspective, this area is challenging, but it's mitigated somewhat by the fact that the missiles that you are trying to shoot down are generally going to be horrendously expensive. So the fact that you're using a small number of horrendously expensive interceptors doesn't worry you potentially as much. The fact those weapon systems tend to be so expensive and few in number also means it might be practical to use expensive and rare systems of your own to knock out the launchers before they can deploy those weapon systems. Another option, instead of trying to intercept the weapon or destroying it before it launches, might be to try and break the kill chain that enables it to be useful in the first place. If you have a multi-million-dollar hypersonic weapon, you're probably not going to guess before you fire it. You're going to want good data on the target you're engaging. So if the satellites are destroyed or the drones are shot down or that intelligent position becomes muddied, your options might become a little bit more limited. The key point here is that while these weapon systems might be very dangerous and pose a major threat to valuable targets like aircraft on the ground, the broad types of countermeasures that might work are generally already understood. The same might be said about active defences against saturation-based threats, although this is also very much an emerging area. Ukraine has led the way in developing ideas on how you would counter something like mass shahed attacks, for example, including anti-aircraft guns, electronic warfare, and also the use of cheaper munitions like laser-guided APKWS rockets. And we've recently seen news that the United States will be diverting about 20,000 guidance kits for rockets that were originally slated for Ukraine through USAI to instead equip US forces in the Middle East, which I'd argue is both probably a very bitter pill for the Ukrainians to swallow, but also evidence of an understanding that these systems can work. We've also seen the increasing use of interceptor drones. These will get their own topic eventually, but the summary is, if you want a low-cost interceptor option to take down a drone, the best option might in fact be another drone. And Ukraine has been making very wide-scale use of these things to bring down not just Shaheds, loitering munitions, and one-way attack drones, but also Russian fixed-wing reconnaissance drones, think the Orlans, that were previously able to roam pretty much at will in some Ukrainian rear areas. Because interceptor drones are affordable, you can potentially have large magazines of them, and while they obviously won't have the performance of a MANPADS or a full-sized air defense missile, the performance might be good enough to take down these kind of saturation-based threats. Operation Spiderweb, though, demonstrated threat type 3. The small UAS, the loitering munitions, indirect fires, the stuff that can get underneath, if you like, a integrated air defense system and potentially cause a lot of damage, even in an irregular action. We've seen a lot of the debate over the last couple of years on how to deal with small drones tending to focus on soft kill mechanisms, jammers, electronic warfare, that kind of thing. The issue with that, as we've seen in Ukraine already, is that you can develop drones that are resistant to that kind of countermeasure. Fibre optic cable guidance, for example, can't be jammed, and using image recognition in combination with AI means that even if a drone is jammed, the autonomous targeting system might be able to pilot it into a target anyway without human operator guidance. Working on the assumption that outside of a broad-scale societal collapse in a dark age, technology tends to go forward, not backwards, I think it's worth assuming that those kind of jam-proof technologies are only going to get better, not worse, which means realistically, active defense systems need to include a hard kill component. There's a diverse range of options we've seen come onto the market here that might be useful in an airfield defense role. You've got things like autocannons firing proximity detonating ammunition with anti-drone radars that might be able to precisely knock down even swarms of drones with accurate fire. You have systems that are coming online in the directed energy space, like Britain's Dragonfire system, which are expensive per unit at the moment and not necessarily useful against a wide array of targets, but which might benefit from a low per shot cost and also very deep magazine depth, which might be useful if you're engaging lots and lots of small targets quickly. The question is, can the technology get to the point where it can be affordably and efficiently deployed, and also can it deal with the kind of saturation attacks that we might see? There's also options when it comes to the smaller stuff. The US Marines, for example, are already adopting the idea that every Marine is in part a drone defender. How might you achieve that? Well, you do it by integrating personal equipment on airfield defense guards or personnel on base that might be able to at least provide some limited defense against low-level drone attacks. What you can see on the right there are two examples. One is an anti-drone scope that's been tested by the US Armed Forces that assists an operator in accurately shooting down drones. What you can see on the bottom is a bit more of a ghetto Russian solution. Basically, that is a shotgun adaptation, essentially, for a regular infantry assault rifle. You could also potentially issue shotguns to airfield personnel for defensive duties, but then you'd have to take away the regular weapon system. So if you wanted to use an existing assault rifle, providing, say, a magazine of anti-drone ammunition, if that proves effective in testing, might also be a worthwhile approach. But a big point here would be that countermeasures to these kind of attacks probably have to be intelligence-led. The best way to prevent one of these attacks is to know it's coming, because if your defense plan relies on the Marines or Air Force personnel on that base being really good at skeet shooting when drones start coming over the horizon, you're not really giving off major military power vibes, and the threat to your very valuable aircraft might be significant. You don't want to lose a bunch of F-35s because the blokes spent all their time training for headshots, not birdshot. And here's the other part of the argument. Even if you're able to put all of those active defenses in place, you have autocannons, you have jammers, you have small missile systems, you have interceptor drones, you have Marines and airmen toting shotguns with birdshot who train each and every day to knock small targets out of the air, and even potentially they know a threat might be coming, so they're actually on alert, unlike the Russians at these bases during Spiderweb, who don't appear to have been out there trying to engage them, at least at the air bases we have the most footage of. I think a safe assumption from a planning perspective should always be that no defence system is perfect, and just as planners once assumed that a bomber will always get through, in the modern day that might mean the drones will always get through. And even if you're able to shoot down 99 out of 100, or 999 out of 1,000, given the massive disparity in the resources required to launch these attacks versus the damage they can do, I'd argue we probably need to do better. That brings us into the next category, the somewhat less popular cousin of active defences, passive defences, which, as the name suggests, are defences that achieve their effect not by doing anything, but just by existing. And as a very general rule, compared to active defences, passive defences don't tend to have as many cheerleaders during budgetary processes. There's always going to be an incentive to invest in major platforms, munitions, etc. Concrete and camouflage nets, outside of niche cases like pre-World War II France, don't tend to get the same attention. That said, I'd also argue they have an impeccable historical record, especially from a cost-benefit perspective. Walls protected cities in ancient times, in some cases for centuries. Trenches were defining as a feature of so many conflicts, including basically defining the entire dynamic of World War I when coupled with the weapons technology of the time. For all of our innovations in weapons technology, there are still few options to protect troops that are more cost-effective than digging a hole and hiding troops underground. For example, here's an image of some cutting-edge anti-drone defences in Ukraine, where the troops are not exposed to enemy surveillance, not exposed to enemy direct or indirect fire, not exposed to FPV drones, drone drops, etc. What they can do is rest in admittedly somewhat austere conditions, and while they might be vulnerable to very heavy ordnance, this provides a degree of protection that would require a multi-layered integrated air defence system to realistically provide. You could give these guys a CRAM battery, short-range air defences, man-pads, Patriot batteries, everything to try and protect them, or you could let them dig a hole in the ground and put a roof over it. And with decent overhead cover, there they are. So what can passive defences as a general rule offer troops, and then by extension potentially the Air Force? 1. Unlike active defences, passive defences, whether you're talking about camouflage netting or a structure, can offer concealment. They can hide your presence. They can make it ambiguous to an opponent whether or not you are there in the first place and whether or not a position is actually worth targeting. If you are targeted, they can then provide protection by putting earth, by putting concrete, by putting steel, by putting a structure of some kind between you and the incoming fire. You can increase the odds that you survive. The Russian experience has been, especially against lower-end Ukrainian threats, passive defences can be worthwhile. This doesn't mean that all passive defences work, obviously, but in the context of a world after Operation Spiderweb and the protection of airfields and aircraft specifically, the passive defences we're talking about are things like camouflage, decoys, and aircraft shelters. Either hardened aircraft shelters like the one you can see on the right there that are intended to provide some degree of protection against incoming weapons, or merely environmental shelters that may not be intended to provide protection against anything more hostile than some slanting UK rain, and which might be lacking features like the reinforced structure and, the door. Hardened shelters for aircraft are very old technology, but when it comes to the debate over whether or not they're worth the resources necessary to build them, different air forces attach different priorities to them. From World War II and through the Cold War, the United States was a massive builder of aircraft shelters, hardened or otherwise. But, and stop me if you've heard this one before, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the sudden evaporation of the air and missile threat they once posed, the US very much took its foot off the pedal, as to be fair, did many of the NATO allies and many other members of the US alliance structure. The US already had a lot of shelters, some of the threat had evaporated, and it wasn't like the Air Force was getting any larger, and so the existing infrastructure might generally have been assessed to be adequate. What's interesting to note, though, is that limited pattern of construction has persisted even as we've seen Russia rearm and the build-up of Chinese military potential. According to a 2023 report by the Hudson Institute, quote, since the early 2010s, examining airfields within 1,000 nautical miles of the Taiwan Strait outside South Korea, the US military has added only 2 hardened aircraft shelters, 41 individual aircraft shelters, 1 runway, 1 taxiway, and 17% more ramp area, end quote. Now, I do feel the exclusion of Korea there is a little bit of a case of cherry picking because we have seen construction go on there, and actually in reasonable decent quantities, as I'll get to a little bit later on. In part, one imagines because of the threat posed by long-range North Korean artillery and missile systems against Allied air bases on the peninsula. But the broader gist of that statement does still hold true. There are a lot of US aircraft operating in the Asia-Pacific that don't have hardened shelters, and in the last decade or so, we haven't seen any sort of US rush to build them. As you can probably guess though, some other militaries have made very different choices. The image you can see on the right there are of older Chinese hardened aircraft shelters that are partially buried. On the left there you can see counts done by some researchers. covering just 5 airfields with the closest proximity to the Taiwan Strait that collectively had 126 hardened aircraft shelters between them. This image here shows another type of People's Liberation Army Air Force hardened shelter. You're looking at a row of large reinforced structures, each easily large enough to accommodate a J-10 fighter. You could argue that from Beijing's perspective, this kind of investment makes a perfect degree of sense. Their primary military competitor, the United States, is famous for having a large stockpile of standoff munitions, especially cruise missiles, as well as a doctrinal love of air superiority and a tendency to try and knock out opposing air forces first in the opening stages of any conflict. On the other hand, if there's something China has proven time and time again that it has a great preference for doing, it's building its way out of any potential problem. And so over the last decade or so, we've seen the People's Republic of China apply that proclivity to engineering and construction-based solutions to really build up those passive defences protecting their air force. As you can see with the graphic on the right there, taken from that Hudson Institute report, while Chinese construction of some other types of airfield infrastructure, like runways, has been relatively modest between the early 2010s and the early 2020s, the construction of new hardened and unhardened shelters has absolutely exploded. Between the early 2010s and the early 2020s, the report has assessed a relatively modest increase in the number of US shelters in the relevant area. For the People's Republic of China, the number of both hardened and unhardened shelters roughly doubled, getting the Chinese military to a point where it had a massive advantage in non-hardened shelters and had significantly narrowed the gap when it came to hardened ones. And while the PRC has perhaps been the most high-profile builder of hardened aircraft shelters on a significant scale, we've seen other powers doing it as well. We do have satellite imagery, for example, to show the Russians were working on aircraft shelters for a number of their combat aircraft. Unfortunately for them, priority does not appear to have gone to the strategic bomber force, that obviously require more expensive, more complex hangars to protect, and which might have been regarded as less vulnerable to Ukrainian attack. After the recent Ukrainian bear hunt, though, we might expect that behaviour to change. With passive defences at Russian air bases receiving a higher priority, even if for the moment that may only mean drone nets and the most basic level of ad hoc protection. Iran likewise has invested in a number of underground facilities to protect at least some of its aircraft, although given recent events, we may get some empirical data soon on how effective these kind of facilities might be, as well as how the survivability of aircraft at these bases compared to the many that are still kept in the open. When it comes to this pattern of construction and passive defences though, recently the US Air Force hasn't really given us any sign that they intend to follow suit. The US Air Force released a base modernisation strategy in 2024, which acknowledged that US air bases could, quote, no longer be considered a sanctuary, end quote, and that facilities needed to be able to support operations even when they were under attack, and yet was largely silent on the topic of building additional hardened shelters for aircraft. Later that year, the US Congress signalled its concern, sending a letter to Frank Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force, which began with the line, quote, American military bases in the Indo-Pacific are under threat. It argued that passive defences may offer the most cost-effective way of strengthening US bases and improving their resilience, and included the line, quote, we are concerned about the alarming lack of urgency by the Department of Defense in adopting such defensive measures. US bases in the region have almost no hardened aircraft shelters compared to Chinese military bases, end quote. But again, if you look at what senior US Air Force officials subsequently said, it doesn't seem that all of them were convinced. In a way, it might be understandable. Air forces do tend to be run by pilots, and pilots tend to like buying things like aircraft. Ultimately, you cannot fly a hangar. Some commentators have also suggested there might be a variety of budget dynamics at play. One of the authors of that Hudson Institute report, for example, is reported to have said, quote, I think the Air Force would rather spend money on combat aircraft than concrete. It's a tough sell to explain to people that precious taxpayer dollars need to go to pouring concrete in Japan, end quote. He also noted that in the US system, funding for military construction is often approved by Congress separate from the rest of the US Air Force budget, and the so-called MILCON VA budget they fit in tends to focus more on issues like base housing and big construction projects within the continental United States. Whatever the case may be, there does seem to potentially be a disconnect here between the potential value of shelters against a variety of threats, including low-end drones, and the extent to which we've seen them appear in the budgets of at least some global air forces. But the disconnect does not appear to be on the importance of base infrastructure. For example, an Assistant Secretary of the Air Force roughly at the time is reported to have said, quote, concrete scares our adversaries just as much as fifth-generation fighters, because the ability to mobilise and the ability to move a force from point A to point B is going to require concrete. It's just that often when we hear statements like that, it's often in reference to building up new air bases or expanding existing ones, not hardening. In 2024, for example, Tim Grayson, who was the Special Assistant to Secretary Kendall, is reported to have said, quote, there's two schools of thought for resiliency. One is to armour and harden the heck out of things. The other is to go with diversity and proliferation. And it's really the latter you know, because what ends up happening is you can spend so much time and money and effort on hardening things, you start degrading your own capabilities, end quote. I might tentatively suggest that while limited resources are a factor, it's entirely possible for hardened infrastructure and dispersed basing to be complementary tactics, and we'll get a bit more into that later. But the final quote I really wanted to surface here before we move on is from Air Force General Kenneth Wilsbach back in 2023. The general's reported to have said, quote, "I'm not a big fan of hardening infrastructure," end quote. He also went on to say, quote, "The reason is because the advent of precision-guided weapons. You saw what we did to the Iraqi Air Force and their hardened aircraft shelters. They're not so hard when you put a 2,000-pound bomb right through the roof," end quote. I'd note that General Wilsbach is now the head of America's Air Combat Command. So with that quote in mind, I thought what we'd do now is put on our defence economics hat, and in the context of the world of all those new threats to air bases we discussed near the start, from the high end all the way down to the spider's web style threat, I want to have a bit of a closer look at some of those arguments for or against building passive defences for aircraft. Basically, think of this section as build or don't build when it comes to the box around your aircraft. I'd argue the most conservative position to take here is that no aircraft should be in the open, that there should be enough shelters in the inventory that any aircraft deployed at least at a permanent base or one within range of enemy weapon systems should have a shelter, hardened or not. As the quotes we just went to would suggest though, there are a couple of core arguments that tend to get raised as criticisms of that very build-heavy approach. We can't go through all of them, but let me summarise 3 big ones. Firstly, these things are expensive. From memory, the reports used an estimate of $6 to $7 million for a hardened fighter shelter, $30 million for a bomber shelter, and in 2020 it was announced the US was now opening for use 20 additional hardened aircraft shelters in the Republic of Korea, which had reportedly been constructed at a total cost of $125 million. That suggests a total construction cost per shelter of $6.25 million. Expensive, sure, but I'd argue relatively affordable compared to the value of the platform they're meant to be protecting. Hardened shelters then might fall in the expensive in absolute terms, but affordable in context column. Potentially valuable for their cost, but still expensive enough that you might be forced to make budgetary trade-offs to get them. Less protected shelters might be considerably more affordable, but obviously still not free. And so in a world of limited budgets, buying additional hangars might mean you're not buying something else, be that additional airframes, munitions, or pilots. Or rather, training and development for those pilots, as combat aircrew are not yet a commonly traded international resource. Issue 2 is their supposed vulnerability, and in that respect, the General absolutely has a point. You can see on the right there what happened to one of Iraq's hardened aircraft shelters when it encountered a US bunker buster bomb during the 1991 war. There are a lot of threats out there that most hardened shelters just won't stop, whether that be a bunker busting bomb, a hypersonic missile, or the kind of multi-100-kilogram warhead you might see on a cruise or ballistic missile. So if your adversary has those kind of weapons in inventory, there might be a risk that you invest a lot of money in building this kind of protection, which then doesn't protect you. The final criticism to flag is that unlike active defences, which can protect the entire force, the entire base from incoming missiles, for example, passive defences only protect the thing they're wrapped around, for lack of a better term. So if, for example, an opponent sees that you've hardened all your shelters so they can't target your aircraft, maybe they just move their targeting to another part of the base. Maybe they shift the focus of their strikes to the runway, for example, putting the airbase out of action by denying your aircraft the ability to take off, even if they can't destroy the aircraft themselves. Put those arguments together and you can understand why sometimes keeping aircraft in the open might seem like the logical budgetary move. Expensive defences that don't work, and even if they do work, just divert enemy fire to other vulnerable targets, don't seem like the best investment. But I'd argue none of those arguments are really fair to what passive defences genuinely cost and what they bring to the table. For one, comparing the cost of constructing a hardened shelter versus procuring an additional aircraft kind of misses the total budgetary burden. Generally speaking, even outside extreme examples like the B-52, if a combat aircraft serves for its entire intended service life, the vast majority of the cost involved is not in buying it, it's in maintaining it. Estimating per-hour flying costs is always complicated, but reimbursable rates can sometimes serve as a bit of a useful proxy. These are the rates that other potential users like other parts of the US government or potentially the film industry have to pay the US Air Force or the US Navy in order to operate some of their aircraft per hour. For example, if the Border Patrol needed to borrow a B-52 for reasons, in fiscal year 2024, they would have needed to shell out more than $55,000 for every single hour that thing was in the air. For an F-16, the cost was closer to $15,000, and for the B-1B Lancer, more than $85,000. And in fiscal year 2020, Government Accountability Office estimates for the flying cost per hour of various aircraft, including both maintenance costs and other operating and support costs, were in some cases even higher than that. Think pushing past $150,000 an hour for the B1s and the B2s. If your per hour flying cost was $150,000 it might put things into perspective to remember that a hypothetical $30 million bomber shelter would only cost the same as about 200 flight hours. And if you're talking about expensive stealthy fighters with smaller shelters, that ratio might look different again. Meanwhile, the shelter obviously doesn't have the same kind of ongoing costs that the aircraft do. It doesn't need a pilot or a crew, it doesn't need fuel, it doesn't need spare parts, it just needs a bit of maintenance to keep it safe, and that's it. So while it might be technically true to say that if I buy 10 fewer shelters, I might be able to buy an additional fighter or a bomber, it might also be true to say that if you retire that same bomber a year or two earlier, you could afford to have it in a shelter for its entire service life and still have one left over at the end for whatever bomber comes next. I'd also argue that simply putting a roof over aircraft rather than leaving them in the open also provides a massive defensive advantage: concealment. Because in a universe where even YouTubers can access custom high-definition satellite imagery of sensitive military locations, and satellites are becoming so significant to kill chains of various militaries around the world, I'd argue it makes sense to complicate that kill chain by making it ambiguous whether or not an aircraft is actually there or not. For example, congratulations, let's pretend for a moment that you're commanding a missile brigade. You have a limited supply of very valuable missiles in your inventory, and you need to give the thumbs up or thumbs down on whether potential targets are worth striking. I'd suggest if you saw this, 5 irreplaceable strategic bombers sitting in the open, you'd probably give the thumbs up. Here we have a section of a Russian airbase where the only aircraft present are obviously painted decoys. Thumbs down. But what about this? Which of these shelters, if any, are worth targeting? Because remember, while shelters are expensive, your inventory of missiles is also limited. And so if you decide to just strike everything because there might be an aircraft there, the opportunity cost in terms of all the other targets you won't be able to strike is potentially going to be massive. Interestingly enough, this might also be an area where different types of defensive ability can compound together. Specifically, aircraft with VLO features, so stealth aircraft, coupled with these sort of concealing ground defences. All else being equal, those stealth features might make it more difficult for an adversary to track those aircraft while they're in the air. If the base they're heading to doesn't have overhead cover, that ambiguity might only last a very limited time. Specifically, only until another satellite passes overhead and the aircraft can be re-identified on the ground. Add some overhead cover though, and absent any other intelligence sources that might be able to peer through it, so to speak, you've potentially turned a significant chunk of the Asia-Pacific into a gigantic shell game, where the next time an opponent knows where the F-22 or F-35 is when they start losing aircraft to an opponent they can't see. Even if an opponent can determine that a shelter is worth attacking with a high-end weapon system, once again, that high-tech intelligence denying tool known as a roof can have a value all of its own. Because unless the structure is completely leveled, it can complicate the task of BDA and the decision on whether or not to re-attack it. For example, if you put a missile into the shelter and then you see the defenders patch up the hole, after a couple of days, how do you determine whether or not the structure is still presumably empty, or whether or not it's now being used again? Do you strike it again just in case, or until the structure completely collapses, or do you take a chance that it's no longer in use? From a defense economics perspective, there is a constant imperative to try and make sure that your opponent is as inefficient as possible with the munitions they have. And from a first principles perspective, one way to do that is to deny them access to accurate information. Aircraft, or potentially later wrecks in the open, provide a degree of certainty. Put a roof on something, and occasionally that's all it takes to go from certainty to ambiguity. And then of course there's the argument about vulnerability, the fact that even hardened shelters aren't invulnerable. Simple physics and material science dictate that that is absolutely true and will likely continue to be true. But I'd argue that, as the Ukrainians very clearly demonstrated, not every threat out there is a 2,000-pound bunker buster. Sometimes you also need to be worried about the 2 to 3 kilogram payload on a drone, or a mortar round, or for that matter in some cases, a half-decent shot on a nearby hill with a 50 cal and a desire to hunt 5th generation fighters. What a shelter can allow you to do is force your opponent to use the right weapon for the job. And especially in a context of all the missiles out there that can carry different warhead types, that might deny them some otherwise potentially attractive options. Right at the top of the list, for example, based on some of the experience we've seen in Ukraine, might be cluster or wide area of effect munitions. Before the Russians adapted, we saw the Ukrainians achieve some pretty stunning results against Russian helicopter bases using just a couple of ATACMS missiles loaded with cluster munitions. It both meant you could potentially hit multiple targets with a single missile, but also that accuracy wasn't as important. In turn, that meant that Russian electronic warfare wasn't particularly important. And indeed, the version of ATACMS the Ukrainians were using at that time didn't even have GPS guidance. It was INS only, which is still sufficient for the task because when you're dumping hundreds of submunitions and covering a wide area, near enough can be good enough. What you're seeing on screen here are images taken from that Hudson Institute report showing the area of effect of a submunition-loaded missile with a 450-foot radius against different American air bases. In each case, all of that red is the result of only 10 missiles. One imagines that if more of those targets were hardened and you couldn't use cluster rounds, you might need different warheads, more missiles, a greater degree of accuracy, or some combination of all three. And I think that starts to touch on the argument of hardening really only serving to shift weapons onto other targets. A counterpoint might be that if those targets were equally attractive with just hitting the aircraft in the open, then those probably would have been the initial targets in the first place, rather than second choice. I brought up this chart, for example, a couple of weeks ago when we talked about America's Golden Dome missile defense system. It's from a section of a 2015 RAND report where in this section, based on different assumptions, the authors were trying to model how many days Beijing might be able to shut down operations at America's Kadena Air Force Base in Korea using a given number of medium-range ballistic missiles, specifically by going after the runways rather than fuel tanks, exposed aircraft, etc. With their base case assumptions, the answer was that it took more than 100 missiles to keep the base offline for 16 days. With faster repair times and lower arrival rates, that figure dropped to 3.6 days. The assumptions used in that report aren't the ones I would use if I repeated that exercise. But all I'm really trying to do here is illustrate the point. There's a massive difference between trying to knock out something repairable like a runway and keep it knocked out, as opposed to going after a bunch of very fragile, very difficult to repair, and almost impossible to replace airframes in the open. From an investment perspective then, based on publicly available war games and the data we have, I'd suggest the best answer might not be mobility and agility, or active defences or passive defences. It's a combination of all of them. Agility and passive defences both make targets harder to acquire and engage. Active defences might lower the odds of munitions hitting their targets, and passive defences the lethality if they make it. And the relative value of those different types of defences might come down to the specific threats you're facing in any particular instance. The aircraft shelter, for example, has one final massive advantage that specifically comes into play if the attack is a surprise. It's always on. In a world where you probably can't have all your defences on high alert all the time, or be constantly shuffling aircraft back and forth just in case an attack is launched, the shelter option has the advantage of providing a cheap, constant level of protection. Meaning if everyone does start suddenly hearing buzzing sounds in the middle of what's nominally peacetime, the surprise value might mitigate a lot of everything else, but it isn't going to change the fact that a 3-kilogram warhead is basically a glorified graffiti tool against a reinforced concrete structure. But if we're arguing about threats like drones and loitering munitions specifically, or the danger of overhead assets identifying aircraft to enable kill chains, it's possible that you may not actually need hardened structures in a lot of cases. And there might be room in some cases for the application of the old 80-20 rule. Basically the old business maxim that a lot of the time you spend 80% of your overall cost getting that last 20% of performance. Sometimes in a particularly high-risk environment like the Korean Peninsula, there might indeed be room for the gold plate option. In this case, a multi-million-dollar reinforced concrete and steel hardened aircraft shelter. But if you're Russia, the United States, or one of the European allies, and you're instead looking at a base that doesn't face that kind of immediate and heavy threat, the greater imperative might not be to try and make all of your aircraft super well protected, but rather just not to make them hideously vulnerable. There's a scene in an old 1970s film, Tora Tora Tora, about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that I think captures this idea fairly well. There's an exchange between two American officers at an airbase on the island before the attack takes place, where, as happened historically, aircraft have been parked out in the open, wingtip to wingtip, so they'd be easy to guard against potential sabotage. And from memory, the quote went something like, "We've got 180 planes on this base, and the way they're parked now, a one-eyed monkey hanging from a balloon could scatter them to hell with one hand grenade." On a completely unrelated note, the United States would lose 180 aircraft destroyed and 159 damaged during those December 7th attacks. If your goal then was just to reduce the vulnerability, to provide a degree of concealment, protection against the elements, as well as lower-end threats like cluster munitions or smaller drones, you could probably afford to scale things down a bit. You just need a structure that can fit an aircraft, has a roof, a door, and ideally is resistant to at least small payloads. There are armies out there, for example, that have experience working with modular shelter kits that can be erected quickly, stop fragmentation and smaller munitions, and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, not millions. In an absolute worst case scenario, just forcing drones to be used to breach the structure before others could access the aircraft inside would still be a significant improvement. Anything to prevent safe and easy access to the valuable aircraft inside. And so rather than predisposing what level of protection might be necessary for any given base, any given unit, or against any given potential opponent, a better way to express it might simply be that from an investment logic perspective, the costs of actively and passively protecting your aircraft on the ground should be just as front of mind as the investments you make into that airframe and its supporting equipment to make it survivable when it's in the air. If wargaming and modelling does suggest that one of the most likely ways for an aircraft to be lost is on the ground, then surely it makes sense to give some consideration as to how to reduce that possibility, with some level of protection basically just being the price of entry. Otherwise, investing in the likes of a $200 million 6th-generation fighter or $600 million bomber runs the risk of kind of being like buying a Lamborghini and then, because you're too cheap to invest in a garage, parking it outside Logan train station. You might get away with it and save a couple of bucks, but I think the Russians and Ukrainians have demonstrated what happens when you roll those dice and lose. It's also worth flagging that aircraft shelters aren't the only form of passive defences out there. Camouflage and decoys, for example, can also be absolutely critical. And the only reason I haven't given them more dedicated attention today is because I already have a video specifically on that topic. But a high-level summary would basically be that in Ukraine, we've seen both the Russians and Ukrainians achieve considerable success, baiting opposing munitions, sometimes quite valuable munitions like ballistic missiles, using a mixture of purpose-built decoys and also deactivated airframes. I know a lot of reporting attention tends to focus on things like basic inflatable decoys, but against a peer or near-peer competitor with excellent sensors and a great ability to process information as it comes in, the greater value might be in truly high-fidelity decoys. Multispectral decoys that look like the real deal to various sensor types, and which can be regularly moved around to mimic the real deal. They may, as has been Russian and Ukrainian practice, be augmented by actual deactivated airframes that have been stripped of spare parts, and then spruced up a bit to serve as decoys for active aircraft. An old deactivated F-15 pulled out of the boneyard, for example, is going to look like an F-15 to just about any sensor you point at it because it's an F-15. The satellite doesn't have to know that you ripped anything valuable off the airframe already, and then made a couple of choice modifications to make it look the part for decoy purposes. In practice, purpose-built decoys might often be the more accessible and more practical option, but in an emergency situation, junked airframes might be a readily available resource. Part of the magic here from a defence economics perspective is that by investing a bit in these various different types of active and passive defence, you can start to potentially turn the math against the missile attacker, while also potentially providing against newer lower-end threats like the small drone danger we've just witnessed. If you're an attacker with a ballistic missile looking at aircraft in the open, you can be reasonably confident that you might get value for money taking that shot. But the more passive and active defences get introduced, the more and more uncertain that prospect becomes. If there's a shelter, you might not even be sure there's a target there in the first place. If there is, if your opponent is known to use decoys, you might not be sure it's a genuine target. And if the decoys are largely indistinguishable to the sensors you're using, and they're present in greater numbers than genuine platforms, then you might rapidly get to the point where you're going to have to fire multiple missiles to expect to get even one genuine kill. Then, as you add more defences, the prospect can get worse and worse. Active defences mean you have to worry whether your missile will arrive in the first place. Defensive electronic warfare or a hardened shelter might cause you to worry whether or not it'll hit accurately enough to destroy the target, even if it does hit. And depending on the type of weapon system you're using, certain passive defences might close off your offensive options almost entirely. Cracking into a hardened aircraft shelter using the warheads you can readily carry on an adapted civilian drone, for example, would be a very different challenge than just going after fueled-up bombers in the open. And even if all of these defences do is introduce uncertainty into the attacker's decision-making, causing them to not attack potentially in situations where they otherwise might, even that might give the opposing air force a little more room to manoeuvre and a better chance to get some punches in before the airframe losses start to mount. So in this post-spiderweb world, where does all of that ultimately leave us going forward? While different air forces around the world will have their own threats to consider, their own economic limitations, their own competing priorities, I think there are a couple of imperatives coming out of Ukraine's recent operation that are broadly universal. Firstly, I'd suggest that air forces, militaries more generally, and those responsible for protecting things like civilian infrastructure need to acknowledge that the threat exists. In some ways, unless you're the Russian military, you're probably feeling kind of lucky that the Ukrainians provided a very high-profile example of this threat against a military target in a way that might prompt some decision-makers to try and get ahead of this developing threat. To do that, they'll need to make the transition from acknowledging a threat to modelling it. figuring out how potential opponents might use these technologies at both the high and low end of the technological spectrum, the kind of threat they pose, and based on that, what the optimum series of defensive investments might be. The answer to that question won't be one size fits all. In many cases, it will likely involve layering active and passive defenses together, taking a serious look at the intelligence side of the problem as well, and then determining where it makes sense to really invest in hardening the relevant infrastructure. Because the situation for these different air forces are likely to be so different, I can't tell you what the answer will always be. But I would suggest that in a lot of cases, building nothing is probably the wrong answer. Against lower-end drone threats, even basic anti-drone netting might help. And even if the protection scheme you come up with isn't that far removed from a bloody wooden roof and a bunch of corrugated iron on a trolley to form the hangar door, that still might have been enough to significantly reduce the damage of the kind of operation we just saw from the Ukrainians. The point probably can't be to make every fuel tank or every aircraft at every airbase invulnerable to a 2,000-pound bunker buster or a hypersonic glide vehicle crashing in at Mach too many. The point is to give the other defences a chance and to protect against that one-armed monkey. Because in the 21st century, that metaphorical threat doesn't have a hand grenade. He's got a van, a truck, a train, a shipping container full of drones, and a desire to seize the record for the most cost-effective counter-air operation in human history. The other side of this is the importance not just of preparing to defend against these tools, but also preparing to use them. Sometimes the best augment to a good defence is an effective offence. And to risk a particularly controversial point here, just because a military might be well funded enough to afford high-end, high-tech, expensive munitions, that doesn't mean it should forgo buying cheaper, effective ones when they're available. Just because you're a major actor doesn't mean you should forget how to fight like an underdog. Protecting the force isn't just about being able to weather an opponent's attack. It's about deterring or diminishing their ability to strike in the first place. And so if the joint force can leverage some of these new striking options at the high or low end to take away some of an opponent's offensive capacity, or force them to divert more of their limited resources into protecting their own force rather than building up this kind of offensive capacity, then indirectly that might help protect the Allied force just as much as a new series of bunkers or a battery of air defence missiles. The core point essentially is that as long as aircraft have the capacity they do to influence the outcomes of military campaigns, there are going to be incentives for adversaries to try and take them out of the equation. The Ukrainians and other actors have now very clearly demonstrated some new ways to potentially do that. The race now for many forces will be to prepare to protect against those technologies and techniques, as well as learning how to use them. And okay, brief channel update to close out. Obviously, once again, we're facing a situation where major international events have just taken place, but I do think it's worth saying, as I've said in the past when discussing conflicts in the Middle East, that while that might be the region that's suddenly topical, I haven't suddenly become a Middle East expert. And given the complexity of the region and the thickness of the fog of war at the moment, I've decided the safest approach is to watch how things develop there for a bit, with the intention being that if I do cover the topic, it'll be once things have crystallised to a significant enough perspective that I think there's enough potentially valuable things to say with a degree of confidence through that defence economics lens. Other than that, I thought this was a natural extension of what we discussed with Ukraine's operation against Russia's strategic bombers last week, basically moving the question from what just happened to how other actors can potentially prevent it happening to them. I hope you got something valuable out of the episode, and with my thanks to all of you for your support and engagement as always, I hope to see you all again next week.